Hearthstone's new expansion has been announced, and it's Whizbang's Workshop. A good friend Whizbang is back, and he brought with him here the coolest card I've ever seen in a card game, along with a handful of other legendaries. We're going to talk about some new mechanics, keywords, all kinds of stuff. But let's talk about this one because it is so sick. Ziliax Deluxe 3000. He's a mech, but you'll notice no stats, no numbers, because while building your deck, you will customize your very own Ziliax Deluxe 3000. And the way this is going to work is kind of like the ETC band manager, where you add them to your deck and then you're going to get a couple slots. And basically, you're going to have 2 slots where you can pick 2 of these different modules to add to your Ziliax. So basically, you're combining the cost of 2 of these, the stats of 2 of these, and then the text of 2 of these. So for instance, you can take the perfect module, which is very close to the old school Ziliax, no magnetic here, mind you. And if you wanted, you could add the recursive module and shuffle that card into your deck. So you'd have a Divine Shield, Taunt, Lifesteal, Rush. It would be a 6 mana 4/3, combining those numbers, and you just have endless Ziliaxes basically with Lifesteal and Rush and all that life gain. Or, you know, you could do crazy stuff like Pylon module. Your other minions have +1/+1 and Twin module, so that you'd have a 7 mana 5/5 that summons a copy of itself. So you'd have 2 7 mana 5/5s, and they would buff each other because of the Pylon module, right? So it'd actually be 6/6s, and technically anything else on board we get buffed +2/+2 because of those extra copies. So it could actually be like, you know, a Savage Roar almost, like, hey, I'm going to just use this as a finisher for tons of damage. You've got the Haywire module here. It's just a big old efficient stat pile. If you want to infuse a bunch of stats into your Ziliax, you can, but at the cost, you know, dealing some damage to yourself. The Virus module here is using the new keyword Elusive, by the way, which is can't be targeted by spells or hero powers. So this is just kind of an alternative pile of stats if you're looking for that instead. Some stickiness with Reborn. Power module, the start of your turn, double this minion's attack. The ticking module seems pretty crazy. It costs 1 less for each minion in play. Keep in mind that does not say friendly minions, so if your opponent is going wide on board, you could use the ticking module here to have a big discount, and I mean potentially just have a free like 4/5 Ziliax with Taunt, Divine Shield, Lifesteal, Rush. So quite a crazy combination. Permutations here are possible, and I'm really curious which of these get played and which ones kind of have an excuse to be in a deck. When you think about it, like it's, you know, you are building this at the deck building phase, not like in a game. Of course, you're not discovering in a game which Ziliax is going to fit the situation, so it doesn't have that sort of in-game adaptability that we sometimes like. So you might end up with a Ziliax that doesn't really fit a game state or a matchup or a game plan, which could be bad. So I think the best Ziliax combinations are going to be those that really go into a deck that has a predefined game plan. Like, I'm going to be a control deck, and because of that I want Lifesteal and Rush. You know, I need life gain. I'm going to be ultimate like value deck, so I want to make sure I have the recursive module. Or alternatively, like, I'm going to be a really aggressive deck, and I'm actually going to put the Pylon module and the ticking module together for a super cheap Ziliax that can buff my board basically. So I just want, you know, that efficiency. Like, yeah, it costs 7 technically, but it might actually just cost like 2 or 3 and just be this, you know, super efficient board buff kind of play. So I guess at the end of the day, it's really just about how many of those combinations actually have that synergistic fit. How many of them are exciting to play in your deck? When I look at a lot of these, I mean, it's like the Virus module. It'd be cool if you could just pick that in a game state where it felt relevant. But is that the one you actually put in your deck? I don't know. Like, that's pretty high cost for just 1/3 and a pile of keywords that don't necessarily go all that well together. There might be some cool stuff with Haywire module just being big, like a 3 mana 5/5 with the Haywire and the recursive module together. Even like the Twin module and the recursive module, you know, some 4/4s on board for 5 mana that just like keep going into your deck and replicating copies of themselves. There's cool stuff to do for sure. So definitely a card to keep in mind, especially with Reno packages. I'm sure even just like a Ziliax that adds itself back to your hand is good enough to see play in a Reno package. So a card I'm sure will get played. How many of the actual combinations here, how many of these pieces get played? I'm not so confident we see most of them. Probably just a few really make the cut and make it feel worth it. But I am excited to try all kinds of different versions of Zilliax for sure. So moving on to another neutral legendary here, we have Califero the Artist. And I think he might be in the game right now if you log in. I think I saw he was the early release one we always get. He's an 8-mana 6/5 battlecry. Draw a minion. Transform all other friendly minions into copies of it. And this is that lowercase all, so this is going to be minions on board, not minions in hand or deck. No, wherever they are either, of course, for that extra clarification. And that makes this card, I think, really clunky to use because it's hard to have a board full of minions and the ability to spend 8 mana on something like Califero the Artist. So how are you piecing those together? On top of that, this is just drawing any random minion. It's not like the most expensive minion. It's not some targeted, tutored sort of thing. So you also have to make sure you get a good result out of Califero. So, I mean, obviously there are like OTKs possible if you draw a Leroy, because Leroy is going to be back in the core set, and you have a board full of 1/1s that turn into Leroy. You can hit your opponent in the face for 1 billion damage, right? But how do you get to that scenario? That's really tough. How do you make sure you draw Leroy? Do you only run one other minion in your deck? That seems like it's gonna fail far too often. So you run a few select things. Are they all trying to do face damage, or some of them just like big scary cards? I actually wanted to play this with like Therazane, just get a bunch of Therazanes on board or something. And then the other side of it though is, how do you have that board? I was thinking about Priest with Swarm of Light Bugs. Like, this is a cheap way to kind of build a board. You can, get 3+ light bugs basically on board for Califero. That might be kind of nice. But not a lot of classes are going to have access to that. There's also, of course, discounts. If you make Califero cheaper in some way, it's going to be easier to piece all that together. But ultimately, this just seems like it's going to require a lot of work, a lot of moving pieces, very specific deck building sorts of challenges. And I don't even know how successful you're going to be able to turn this into a real win condition. Sometimes it's just going to be a board you spend all this work on that doesn't really do all that much. So when I add all that together, this just feels like a card that is really hard to pull off, really hard to support. I don't see any easy or obvious lines for this one, and I think it's going to be hard to turn this into a reliable piece. But should be fun. We're going to do some crazy stuff with it, I'm sure. Just not going to be a great card, I suspect. Moving on here, we got the return of Dr. Boom. I guess he's kind of the bad guy to Whizbang in this expansion, it sounds like. This is Inventor Boom, an 8-mana 7/7. Feels so wrong to see that 8. I wonder if he got nerfed a little bit here to 8. Battlecry resurrect 2 friendly mechs. They cost 5 or more, and they immediately attack random enemies. I could certainly see why that would get nerfed. That is a lot of board, number one. You're getting 3 bodies out of this. And that is potentially face damage as well, because that is random enemies, not random enemy minions. So if your opponent doesn't have stuff, or if you just get lucky, you can send 2 giant mechs to face, because these are going to be mechs that cost 5 or more. So you're not like restricted from playing small stuff early, because they'll play a bunch of small mechs early in the game. It's not going to hurt your boom as long as you get 1 down, or 2 down between turns 5, 6, and 7 prior to your 8 cost boom. Then you're going to have potentially some great results. We're also going to see, of course, some new mechs, it looks like here, with Fireworker in particular. Looks like a great result for Inventor Boom. So yeah, I like that this card is both threat development, sometimes removal. If your opponent has a couple 5/5s on board, you got a couple Fireworkers in the pool, that could be a great little combo to clear those out. Or sometimes just lethality and face damage, and sometimes maybe you'll be able to put some really giant mechs in the mix so that your opponent's like getting hit for 10 plus or something if you find a big enough mech to get resurrected. So that looks great to me. I'm sad it's not 7 mana from a flavor standpoint for Dr. Boom, but I think 8 mana sounds pretty fair for this sort of play. Also keep in mind too that we do have Bran still in Warrior, Reno Bran, so you can get double battle cries off this Inventor Boom if you put this in a Reno deck. So that is 4 mechs getting resurrected, 2 and 2, that all attack random enemies. That could still be a kill shot basically all at once with this. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be in a Reno deck. I'm sure there's going to be some kind of mech package that makes sense for this. You don't have to go crazy with mechs. So just kind of any tempo we build with this as a sort of finisher or top end looks pretty sensible to me. And then also maybe some Reno lines as well to blow this up on battle cries. So Inventor Boom looks like a very good, very high output kind of card. So let's talk about that Fireworker card. 5 mana, 5/5 mech. Death Rattle, summon 2 1/1 boom bots, and warning, bots may explode. So we are getting some boom bots back here, which this is pretty cool with Inventor Boom, right? Like you play this down, it dies off, hopefully, you get a couple boom bots, then your Inventor Boom resummons this. It's potentially going to like trade in or whatever to a random enemy minion, and then you might get some more boom bots. So you get these chains of boom bots going off over and over again. Some cool little death rattle synergy potential there. And 2, with boom bots getting left behind, that can enable things like magnetic if your opponent just can't clean up all of these various bodies staggered across multiple spots. That can enable your magnetic cards to actually pack quite a punch and sometimes hit face for some extra damage or trades or whatever it might be. So this is just a sticky pile of stuff. Now, I will say, like if you showed me this card 6-7 years ago or whatever, I would have thought this was completely insane. And I think a lot of our kind of Hearthstone lizard brains look at this and go, yes, it's nuts. Look at all of this stuff. I don't think this is quite as crazy these days, though. It does lack some of that immediate impact that we often look for in cards. 5 mana, pretty expensive. It's just to plop down a 5/5 that's sort of passive. These Death Rattle boom bots maybe take a while to interact. The boom bots themselves are kind of risky in how good they're going to be. A couple pings to face for 1 or 2 damage may just not add up to all that much. So it does feel to me like this card needs help. It needs a kind of critical mass of mechs or magnetics, or maybe the Dr. Boom payoff to really get there. In and of itself, I think it's actually probably a pretty middling card these days, which is kind of crazy to think about, but that's my estimation. So it does likely need that mech package to feel worth it, that synergy to really bring it to life. That said, it looks like we're going to get that, right? It looks like this package is going to be well supported. So I do still have some faith here in the Fireworker. Moving on to Toy Captain Tarim. And this is introducing a new keyword here, miniaturize. Miniaturize means when you play this card, it's going to add a mini copy to your hand. You can see here the mini copy. Those are all going to be 1 mana 1/1 versions with the same effect. So you play your Toy Captain Tarim for 5, then you get this 1 cost Toy Captain Tarim. And this one is such a cool design, I think, because Toy Captain Tarim is a 5 mana 3/7 with taunt and battle cry. Set a minion's attack and health to this minions. So that can be used, of course, aggressively on your Silverhand Recruit to turn it into a 3/3 to make it a little bigger, or of course to debuff your opponent's cards, much like we saw with the Tarim of old. Now that one did go across the entire board. This one is only impacting a singular minion, which is notably worse, especially since this only costs 1 less mana and it's coming out like 5 years later or whatever, right? That's not necessarily great, but the Toy Captain Tarim being there as a backup is actually pretty nice, because that 1 mana 1/1 is suddenly a great debuff on an opponent's card. Being able to turn whatever big Titan or crazy minion into a 1/1 so that you can clean it up really easily is actually rather nice. It does, give your opponent a little bit of information. Once you play Toy Captain Tarim, they're going to know you have the mini versions. They're going to feel a little bit susceptible to that potential, but nonetheless, I think that threat is still important, can slow them down, create friction, and ultimately still is there to deal with something. So pretty cool here to use this. You get kind of the upside version of buffing something of your own potentially with Tarim, and then the upside of using the second half of it more defensively to deal with your opponents. There are also, of course, some like hand buff synergies to consider with a card like this. If you want to commit to a more aggressive game plan for Tarim, you can run a bunch of hand buff cards, make your Tarim really big, right? Make him a 7 attack, 10 attack, whatever, and then buff a Silverhand Recruit that's attacking on board up to 10 for some crazy damage output. Now the Toy Captain Tarim will still be a 1/1, but theoretically, even if that was in hand, you could start buffing it up as well, and again use it offensively, although you're probably going to want to use that one in a defensive pinch most of the time. So I think this is a really cool, elegant design. I am worried a hair about efficiency here, because when it compares to that old Tarim, man, it feels too close in size and cost, but pretty limited in its scope and impact compared to that old one. And that is a very old card, despite being super powerful in its era, right? It was absolutely nutty when it came out. I don't know how this compares, 5 years later. It feels like it might have fallen off a little too far comparatively, and that does make me nervous, but I do think this is an incredibly clever design. So again for Paladin, we've got another miniaturized card here. This is Tigress Plushie, a 3-mana 3/2 beast. It's got Rush, Lifesteal, and Divine Shield, which is sort of like Ziliax, which is kind of crazy for 3 mana. Of course, it doesn't have Magnetize or Taunt like Ziliax, but still, man, that's really efficient stats and keywords for 3. That's nuts. And then you get the mini Tigress Plushie here, which of course is a 1-mana 1/1 version with the same keywords, which that one's a little bit less interesting, I would say, but still not bad, right? It's just a sticky 1-drop body. Pop off your opponent's Divine Shield. Use it as a buff target, right? If you have some buffs in hand, this can actually scale up really nicely. That Lifesteal's nice. The Divine Shield helps you take some great trades. So just a couple super efficient keyword and stat minions in a class that we know already loves Divine Shields. It loves buffs targets. It loves these aggressive early onboard bodies. So to me, these both just look really good. Moving on to Druid here, we've got the Chia Drake, which is a lot like a Chia pet that's a dragon. It is a 4-mana 2/4. It's got miniaturized, of course. Choose one, gain spell damage +1, or draw a spell. And then obviously you got the 1-mana 1/1 version of that. So this is pretty cool, right? Like the first half of the Chia Drake does not feel very efficient to me, right? A 4-mana 2/4, drawing a spell, okay, cool. Whatever. Druid's got tons of ways to draw cards, right? And we know Druid can draw so efficiently. They've just historically as a class been so good at that I don't think I'm excited to play a 4-mana 2/4 card that draws a spell. But it might be worth it just to get the upside of a 1-mana 1/1 that I can gain some really cheap spell damage on. Because what you might be doing is trying to get like a couple cheap mini Chia Drakes in hand so that you can like spend 2 mana for this spell damage upside, or maybe, you play your first Chia Drake early and then you play your second Chia Drake and the 2 mini Chia Drakes all at once for +3 spell damage. And you try to create some sort of combo or upside on this spell damage. There are obviously ways to copy that, create extra copies of these in Dragon Druid builds. So maybe there's some shift to a different finisher for Dragon Druid. Alternatively, if you don't care about the spell damage, the second Chia Drake, a 1-mana 1/1 dragon that draws you a spell, feels great. Having those dragon bodies in hand is important, and that is just super efficient spell cycle on a stick. So is the spell damage upside worth it here? Is the kind of, you're paying a high cost for the first half, but then you're really excited about the second half. Is that going to line up well for Druid game plans? I'm not sure. It's hard to say, but I think if this does carve out a space for itself, it might be because of that super cheap spell damage you can get multiple copies of, doing something interesting. I'm not quite as convinced on the dragon side of things or on the drawing side of things that the upside of the back half is worth it for the cost of the front half, if that makes sense. All right, so moving on here to the Amateur Puppeteer, new Death Knight miniaturized card. Single blood, single unholy, 5-mana, 2/6, undead. Miniaturized taunt, death rattle, give undead in your hand +2/+2. The mini version, obviously a 1-mana 1/1, same effect. So some hand buff stuff. And we've actually seen hand buff as this package in Death Knight that just really hasn't gotten played much at all. There's like blood tap here. If you look at this, remember, it's double blood here, so you can do like a double blood and kind of an undead build, adding all of this together, get some corpses. We're actually going to look at another card in this video with a return of Spellstones. This is also going to be a blood hand buff card. So supporting this hand buff package, and interestingly too, the first half of the Puppeteer, if you play it on 5, can buff the second half of your Puppeteer, so that could be like a 1-mana 3/3 you're playing down on turn 6. That probably feels better, maybe alongside some other hand buff stuff. The question always for hand buff is like, how well can you play the game while keeping all of your minions in hand? Like, if you're doing stuff like blood tap or whatever, right? Like we just showed, you're kind of passing some tempo early, and are you going to be able to recover enough and develop enough of a win condition off of those stats in the mid to late game to make all of those early game and early turn sacrifices worth it? Because this comes down pretty late as a 5-cost card, right? Stuff getting buffed on turn 5, you're playing on turn 6, it's not really maybe attacking or impacting as much until even later than that. So you do need perhaps really specific kind of payoff cards that are able to put these stats into play immediately, turn them into lethality in some sort of way, which when this is looking at undead specifically, maybe that's a little bit limiting, right? These other blood hand buff cards were hitting all sorts of things. This is only hitting undead. So it's encouraging this undead blood unholy hybrid thing that I don't know, man. It's going to be hard to get all of this working together, I suspect. And I worry that these stats are going to come down too late and your opponent will already be developing crazy win conditions or just finding removal, right? Like, oh, okay, I finally got all my hand buff stats down and the opponent reknows my board. So I don't know. I don't want to write off this package because it may be something they commit to a ton and it just, it has that payoff because they've just pushed it so hard. But just looking at the numbers on this, the timeline on this, and the historical precedents for this, I don't have a ton of hope right now. Moving on to that Spellstone card here, we have the Lesser Spinel Spellstone. That is quite a mouthful. 1 mana, single blood, give undead in your hand +1/+1, and gain 5 corpses to upgrade. And then it goes to +2/+2, and finally +3/+3, which of course, 1 mana, give undead in your hand +3/+3. That is like crazy efficient, but you do have to get 10 corpses to get it to that point. And it's interesting, right? Because you want minions in hand to be buffed for your hand buff cards, but to get corpses, you want to put minions into play. And, obviously there are spells that can summon minions, but that's another card that's not a minion in hand. So there is something at this that feels like it's at odds with itself. Maybe there are going to be some cards that come along. It's like you play a minion, you get one in hand. There's obviously ways to do that, but it still feels like you're going to be sacrificing something to get all of this working. And again, this is a card that perhaps takes a while to pay off, which is not necessarily ideal. You want to get stats into play sooner rather than later. Stats are more likely to make a direct impact in the game earlier in the game rather than later in the game because of that removal, because your opponent's win conditions coming online. It's just how it works. So the fact that this is delayed behind these two Spellstones to really feel insane, that's a bit of a hesitation. Now, of course, you can get corpses in other ways. There are cards that just, immediately add corpses to your hand and stuff. But again, that's not a minion. That's not a minion in hand getting buffed. So I don't know. This feels like it's got a kind of a tempo challenge, a deck building challenge, a timing challenge. It's just hard to put a lot of faith in this, but clearly something they are pushing at least a little bit in this set. So next up here is the new Shaman Shadow spell, the incredible value, 3 mana, discover a 4-cost minion and set its attack and health to 7. So you can play this on 3 and then you get your big 4 mana 7/7. Wow, what a meme, right? What a meme. I'm just not convinced this is any good though. Discovering a 4-cost minion, there are some really good results, of course, as always, things that can turn those stats into more meaningful effects. I was thinking about like Brass Elemental and Shaman. This card got printed and we've never seen it since, but this is a 7/7 is insane, obviously, right? It is completely wipe out your opponent's board, but Discover doesn't have a class bias anymore, right? So you're not any more likely to get a Shaman card than you are a neutral card. And when you look at neutral cards in particular, right, there's going to be a lot less good 4-drop. So what are the odds of you hitting something actually insane and instead of, just whatever random thing? Sheriff Barrel Brim or a Sinjin Shieldmaster, okay, I got a 7/7 taunt, which not bad, right? Still pretty good, but not at the cost of giving up your entire turn 3, right? So whatever stats you gain off this, so you're sacrificing tempo on 3 to gain a little bit back on turn 4. That actually doesn't feel like incredible value to me at all. That feels like a pretty big risk. So I think you have to get some minion that's able to utilize that stat buff in a really neat way, in a really big way, and do something extra special out of it to make it worth it, which I just don't think that's going to happen consistently enough for it to be good. I mean, there are some home runs, right? Like this is an insane home run. This gets you 2 7/7s, like, are those punchy moments going to be worth it? How often does it just do, basically absolutely nothing and you pass a turn 3 for it? I'm worried too often it's going to do basically absolutely nothing. There are some pretty good 4-drops in the pool, but some that are just, taunts or useless effects as well. So consistency might be the really big downfall on this card. Speaking of 4-drops, it's Nesting Golem. And I know what you're going to say already. Regis, this is insane with incredible value. Make it a 7/7 and it's basically a Rattlegore. But keep in mind that this has the exact same wording as Rattlegore. And Rattlegore, if it got buffed, would still look at the base stats when resummoning. So Rattlegore would basically always summon an 8/8, even if you buffed him to like 20/20. I assume Nesting Golem, even if you summon him as a 7/7, will resummon a 3/2 in that case. But that still, it makes Nesting Golem a pretty interesting card in general, because this is, again, just a pile of stuff and stats. 4/3 body, maybe not the most exciting for 4 mana, right? But this is the like super piloted shredder where you're getting that Bloodfin Raptor back right away, and then that's also going to give you a 2/1 as well on the back of that. So you're getting the little Murloc guy too. Reverting to all the classic examples here, but that's just 3 bodies, and in particular they're all undead, so there could be some really interesting things here with undead synergies, corpse synergies, and Death Knight definitely come to mind, because this is just, again, multiple bodies, multiple corpses, multiple undeads, which all seem to pay off. Hand buffs, I think, do not synergize with this, unless, again, maybe they changed it. Maybe they changed how it works. You know, maybe they didn't like the way Rattlegore works. Maybe they do recognize hand buffs in this one, but I doubt it. I think ultimately you'll still be sticking to the standard expected results, but that doesn't make this bad by any means. I think this actually still has some interesting potential, even as a neutral card. So next up here, we have Wind Up Musician, a 6 mana tradable 5/5 battlecry, deal 1 damage to all enemy minions and trade to upgrade. So you trade it in, you draw it back, it deals 2, 3, 4, you know, eventually 5, 6, whatever. And there is a point where that's certainly good. You know, I think probably dealing 3 is okay. Dealing 4 or 5 starts to feel really good for a card like this, but that does require you to trade it, you know, 3, 4 times basically to get up to the really good feeling numbers. And that is a lot of trades to make this card feel good. We like tradable stuff. Tradable is a really good keyword. Lots of great tradable cards, but I don't think you like the fact that this card is probably very bad until you've traded it a few times, because usually tradable cards, we like them at a base level, and we want them to work at a base level, and we don't want to have to feel like we're forced to trade them or invest. Like when we don't need them and we can trade them in for a look at something else, that's great. That's a nice upside for the card to have, but it still needs to be good at a base. And I don't think this is good at a base. I don't think it's good after a couple trades, and you might trade it in and hope for it later, and then it just, you know, disappears for a while, and it takes a long time to actually get this, and then you're just kind of running a dead card in your list far too often. So I think this will just feel clunky. It'll feel dead too often. You top deck it, you're like, oh man, I needed a good card, not the Wind Up Musician that's still just dealing 1. So ultimately, I just don't see any decks really needing this. They probably just have access to better, cleaner removal. And then finally, we have the Corridor Sleeper. I think this is in the game right now as well. This is a 1 mana 3/5 beast. It starts dormant, and after 7 minions die, it awakens. So you get yourself a really efficient 1-drop here for 3/5, but it does take a while for this to pop up. And then sometimes even once it does pop up, you may not really be able to attack with it right away or whatever. It might just be sitting there. But at 5 health, you know, that is definitely some friction for your opponent. So I think this is a card that probably feels good-ish. Would play it on turn 1, and probably feels really, really, really bad any other time it's played. And unlike the Corridor Creeper, number 1, this is a little smaller than Corridor Creeper was as a 5/5. This, you don't really get to like develop it in a big kind of predictable controlled swing all at once. Like the Corridor Creeper, you know, you can develop with multiple threats. You can develop it behind a Loatheb or something, right? Like to protect it. Basically, the fact that it was 0 and you could put it all out at once allowed you to kind of do it in key moments. Sometimes you just play it as early as possible, of course, but there was a little bit more nuance, a little bit more control to how that threat was developed, what kind of board sides went along. And then also, you know, still good sometimes drawing it late too. This, I think, you know, you draw this on turn 5, you're like, when am I ever, this is just so bad, you know, it's gonna take 3 or 4 turns to get this up, maybe turn 8 or something before this actually even makes an impact. This also kind of shows the game plan to your opponent, so they actually get information to play around this. Like, oh, I see they have a Corridor Sleeper, I'm gonna slow my roll a little bit here, make sure I don't play just like little chip minions that I otherwise normally would have, which with the Corridor Creeper, sometimes you could kind of play around that, although I guess in that era everybody knew you had Corridor Creeper, so maybe that's not true. It's like every deck had it anyway, so you're kind of playing around it no matter what. Regardless, I just think this feels notably slower, notably smaller, notably worse in mini game states, and ultimately is probably not the sleeper of the set. But I don't know, maybe it's just so good when you get it down on one that it's still worth it for decks to run it. Although I suspect it's not going to be the case. I think it's just too risky. One drops are good these days, and the meager stat upside on this probably doesn't make up for its downsides in my mind. Okay, so now let's rate these cards from 1 to 5 stars. Ziliax Deluxe 3000 is a 4-star card. Califero the Artist is a 2-star card. Inventor Boom is a 5-star card. Fireworker is a 3-star card. Toy Captain Tarum is a 3-star card. Tigress Plushie is a 4-star card. Chia Drake is a 3-star card. Amateur Puppeteer is a 2-star card. Lesser Spinel Spellstone is a 2-star card. Incredible Value is a 2-star card. Nesting Golem is a 3-star card. Wind Up Musician is a 2-star card. Corridor Sleeper is a 2-star card. And there you go, quite a mixed bag. Some stuff I think is going to be pretty good. Some mediocre stuff. There is usually some filler in this initial reveal, which always surprises me, but they like to show off just some flavorful, like, neutral cards and stuff while saving up some punchy class cards for later. But regardless, Ziliax is probably one of the coolest cards I've ever seen in any card game ever, so super excited to see what people cook up with this one, the kinds of deck lists this makes sense for. But very excited. Whizbang's Workshop looks like it's going to be a pretty fun expansion. Stay tuned for more reviews. I will be a little bit spotty with this card review season, at least through February. I'm going to be doing some traveling the last week of February. I suspect I'll probably miss a few Hearthstone card reviews, but hopefully when I get back, I'll be able to get into full swing and get a pretty good schedule going. But just don't be alarmed if I miss a few here and there, especially over the next couple weeks in particular. That said, thanks so much as always for watching. Curious to hear your thoughts on these cards, and until next time, game on.